Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with the next chapter in our online training about decision services. This chapter introduces a fundamental benefit of decision services, the ability to create a reference to the service inside Oracle Policy Modeling. Let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to describe to you in detail what a reference is, show you how to create it, how to update it, and we're going to compare references to inclusions. At the end of the presentation, we'll see a demonstration of how to create and update a reference in Oracle Policy Modeling. So what exactly is a reference? Well, a reference is something that you add on the Rules tab. And from the Rules tab, when you click New Reference, you create a connection to the contract of a decision service. The reference can be either to the project development version or the deployed version. Following the creation of a reference, you will be required to map between the contract of the decision service and the project that you have in Oracle Policy Modeling. So in this screenshot, you can see that I have selected a decision service. After the name, you see the word project in brackets to tell me that this is the development thread of my decision service. I ask when this decision service reference should be used, once per case. The vocabulary that we saw in decision services reappears here, so that if I am mapping my decision service to an entity in Oracle Policy Modeling, I will need to change that property to refer to my entity. Underneath, we can see the contract, the decision service inputs, current date, first input, second input, and so on, and the decision service outputs, new res, the result, and so forth. The rule designer is expected to populate the required elements on the right-hand side with attributes or relationships from Oracle Policy Modeling. Typing in the relevant boxes will create a drop-down of available values. If I type something that does not exist, for example, if in the first box for current underscore date, I type my attribute, and my attribute doesn't exist in OPM, it will be created and mapped. So if you are working with an existing OPM project, use the autocomplete to avoid accidentally creating spelling errors and generating extra attributes. So here is a screenshot of a completed version. Notice the error message at the top of Oracle Policy Modeling. I have attempted to reference in the input and the output the same entity. If you notice that I have all instances of the person referred in both the input and the output. This is the cause of the error message. An entity in Oracle Policy Modeling cannot be used both for input and output. You will need two entities. In the background of the screenshot, you will also notice that on the Rules tab, references appear as documents with a .ref extension. So here is the same scenario, now corrected. You'll notice that the person input object has been mapped to all instances of the person, and I have created a second entity in my OPM project called the person output, and I have used that in my mapping of the decision service output, all instances of the person output. So it's important to realize that the structure of your Oracle Policy Modeling project may have to be adjusted to take into account the structure of the decision service. Returning to the reference in the Rules tab and double-clicking it causes the dialog to reappear. We can then update references by typing in attribute names, accepting defaults, or creating attributes. You may be forced to update the reference because you have changed attribute names in Oracle Policy Modeling, or because the decision service has changed since you last referenced it. There is a degree of overlap between references and inclusions. There are great reasons for using both, and the reason for the existence of inclusions is not changed by the arrival of references. There are, however, some high-level pluses and minuses in respect of decision services. Decision services are only in English, so if you already have projects written in your own language, that will make things like mapping a challenge. If you have rules that change frequently, decision services might be a good choice, because deploying a new version of the decision service, provided the contract doesn't change, the OPM project does not need to be redeployed, because the decision service will be accessed according to the contract that was already defined. If your decision service needs an explanation or a decision report, be aware that no such thing exists today in decision services. Finally, the fourth point. If you plan on creating services that should be managed by people who are not familiar with Oracle Policy Modeling, you essentially wish to outsource the manage of some services, then decision services are a good choice because they are pure web-based. So in this brief but important chapter, we introduced the subject of a reference, the ability to refer to a decision service from within Oracle Policy Modeling, and to create a reference by clicking in the Rule tab and clicking New Reference. The reference itself is made up of mappings, so as your project in OPM changes or the decision service evolves, the mappings may have to be updated as well. Indeed, error messages may appear if mappings have changed in the decision service, which cause the mapping to be out of date. Finally, we spoke about the concept of a reference versus an inclusion. We know that an inclusion is a practical way, for example, of embedding a set of reusable rules or reusable screen elements inside a project. A decision service introduces the idea of being able to embed a piece of business logic in multiple projects and not having to redeploy the OPM project just because the decision service has had its logic changed, provided the contract remains the same. In the demonstration that follows, we'll create a reference, we'll perform mapping, and we'll see how changes to the mapping are handled in the dialogues in Oracle Policy Modeling. In this demonstration, we're going to create an Oracle Policy Modeling project and then create a reference to our decision service and observe the behavior of the reference and understand how to create mappings. So I'm here in my Oracle Policy Modeling. I'm going to create a new project, which I'll call Decision Demo 1. I'll set the language to English and the region to United States English. So here in my project, for the purposes of my demonstration, I'm going to create a new entity called the person. And I'm going to change my relationship text to the people, if I could spell it right. I'm going to create an attribute called the person's date of birth. Now I'm going to go to the Rules tab and click New Reference. Once I've logged in, I am presented with a dialog and I'm able to choose from the decision services. I can choose from a deployed decision service, or I can choose from a decision service currently being developed. When I select the project, I will see the inputs and the outputs from the decision service contract. So in this case, you can see that we have in inputs, we have an object called the persons, and we have a person's date of birth and the person's name. We also have a top-level attribute called current date. These are the technical names which refer directly to the contract items defined in the decision service. At the moment, I do not have any attribute in Oracle Policy Modeling that I can map to this input. So if I type the date of the interview, the attribute will be created in my Oracle Policy Modeling project. As regards the person's input object, I have an entity with a containment relationship called the people. The persons in italics is referring to the text that was used in the decision service. So I have to be sure to select that which refers to my containment relationship. The person's date of birth and the person. Again, the attribute in Oracle Policy Modeling is called the person, and I am mapping it to the person's name. I'm going to click Save, and you'll notice that I have an error message saying that I must have at least one mapped output field. So before I start mapping the output object, I will go ahead and output the number of people. Let's see what that does. In my Data tab, I can see that in the global, I now have the number of people and the date of the interview, both of which have been created for me because of the mapping I entered in the mapping dialog. In the person entity, however, I haven't had any attributes created because I was careful to enter the attribute text of existing attributes and an existing relationship. I'm going to return to the Rules tab in just a moment. But in order to be able to demonstrate the complete process of this decision service, I need to create a second entity, which I'll call the person output. And I'll need to change this just to make it easier to read, the people output. I'll return to my Rules tab and I'll double click the reference. I can now complete the mapping. I choose the people output and I have decided that I will now enter a variety of attributes and I will get Oracle Policy Modeling to create them. The person output can purchase recreational drugs. I am careful to include the person output to ensure that Oracle Policy Modeling places the attribute in the correct entity, saving me time basically. And I'll click Save. So far, I have mapped the person in and the person out. You will notice that my output entity is in italics. Since it is not an entity that can be entered by an end user, it is an entity which is provided by my decision services. I will now create a new screen, and I will add an entity collect to collect the person and the person's date of birth. And above that, I will collect the date of the interview. I will switch into tabular mode. And I'll adjust the column headers. I will add a second screen. And I will add an entity container showing the output. And again, I will switch into tabular mode. I will run the debugger. And in the debugger, I will set today's date as the date of the interview, and I will create 3 people. This is the input that I'm providing to my service. When I click the next button, because this screen is not relevant, it will jump immediately to the interview complete. So I'm going to export my scenario and go back and verify that this screen is shown always. And then I'll return to the debugger. And I'll import my scenario. Run the debugger. And in the debugger, I'll set the date of the interview to today's date, and I'll add 3 people. This represents the input that will be passed through the input contract to the decision service. As we can see, the output is the 3 members of this entity, the age, which is newly calculated, and the 2 Boolean attributes, which have a true value or a null value, you'll recall from my previous demonstration, according to which person it is. Let's look at a second example. I create a new project, and I go to the Data tab, and I create an entity called the hazardous waste. And I'll leave it as all instances of the hazardous waste. Create a new reference, select the project that's being developed, enter the output contract elements because there are no fields to map in input, and enter two pieces of text which will be created as attributes in Oracle Policy Modeling. To save time, I've gone ahead into the Interview tab and created a new screen called Hazardous Waste Output with an entity container displaying the two attributes. When I click Debug, provided that my connection to the hub hasn't timed out, I should see exactly what I expect to see, which is the output, a list of hazardous wastes. Now let's look at a couple of scenarios that you might meet in your daily life. The first one I'm going to do is I'm going to change the text of one of these attributes from level to gravity. Why not? When I return to the Rules tab and click the hazardous waste reference, you will notice that the gravity has been picked up. Attribute text changes are managed without any need to intervene on your part. However, if I go to the Data tab and I change the text, all of the instances of the hazardous waste to the hazardous wastes, you will see a warning on the Rules tab telling me that the relationship is unknown. I will need to return and update the relationship text. Then when I debug, my service will continue to function as normal. More complex changes, such as, for example, introducing a new attribute and changing the identifying attribute. When I debug, I will receive an error message. Not particularly explicit error message, but an error message nonetheless. I will need to go back through my attributes, verifying that in the output object I include the attribute text of the identifying attribute. Now I don't have the error, but since my entity collect is referring to the other attribute, I will need to go to my interview, remove the waste name, and add the waste title. Finally, let's go to the decision service and let's make a change to the decision service. We'll go to the output field called hazard gravity, and we'll change this to hazard level. And we'll commit the change. Returning to Oracle Policy Modeling, we'll debug again. And we see an error. Cannot build the project. Please fix the following errors and try again. We need to return to the Rules tab. The decision service configuration is no longer valid. And the attribute has been removed because the decision service output contract has changed. So I can now put in the hazardous waste gravity, which I think was the name of my attribute. But you'll notice that I'm unable to save it. I will have to delete the reference and rebuild the reference. As a byproduct of that, over time, I may find that I have extra attributes that I've accidentally created. But now that I've recreated the reference and click debug, I can see the output. That concludes our demo for decision service references. I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter.